when television started in 1960, we had a very nominal daily news service. That was about the only live program. Then they introduced Sportsroom, which was a program to have once a week with interviews on prominent sports people. But after it had been going for about 6 months, the Australian and New Zealand rugby league team were due to play in Auckland, and I was well known for my involvement of promoting rugby league. And the person who was running Sportsroom at that time, fronting it, was Eric Boggs, the Auckland and New Zealand sort of top rugby player who was actually fronting the program. And at that stage, he was involved with a so-called non-commercial, non-professional rugby union, and he didn't want to interview the captains of the two teams. So I was invited to go along and trial for it, and I did a trial in the afternoon, and the end result was that I did the interviews with the captains that night after talking to the producer about why did they have sports people to run television shows. Well, the next morning the phone goes, and Jack Metcalf, who was the head producer of Television New Zealand at that stage, said, "We love what you did last night. We'd love you to take up a Sportsroom full-time as the compere." And I said, "Well, that's a very nice thing to do, but I'm not sure that I know enough about sport to do that." And he virtually repeated to me what, in fact, his director the night before reported that I'd actually commented about, the difficulty with changing the style to television. And he said, "Oh, you're doing exactly what television's all about," in which they went doing. That's how I ended up being a sports commentator. Well, the two fullbacks playing that day in the trial match, Jack Fagan and Billy Harrison, had both been with me I'd been with them on the tour of England, and I knew their background. And Billy Harrison scored a brilliant try, and I stupidly said on air, "If that doesn't win Billy Harrison a place in the New Zealand team next week, I'll swim to Devonport blindfolded." Well, Jackie Fagan was the top kicker in the country, and they put Fagan in, who also worked at the Harbour Board. So I was immediately challenged by his fellow members of the Harbour Board workers to swim to Devonport blindfolded, which I decided to do. And thank God, Leo Dromgoole, who ran the Harbour ferry services, rang me up and said, "Would you like me to put a heated swimming pool on the back of the Herald, and we'll get you to swim across on the back of the boat?" So I had to dive into the harbour to show that I was starting to swim, but I mentioned that I was going to go with the back of the Herald, back of the boat. And no one realised until the ferry took off that I was actually swimming to Devonport blindfolded on the back of a boat. So I suppose that you could call that was the commentator's curse. Don't make stupid remarks on air that you can't back up. In 1967, the government had decided to have a referendum, first of all, whether we still wanted 6 o'clock closing and the big swill, or do we want to move to 10 o'clock? And whether or not to have a 3-year parliament continue or to extend it to 4 years. Well, for reasons I don't know, I was invited to host the evening results of the election campaign, and within 5 or 10 minutes of the election being over, I managed to forecast what the result was going to be, and I got it right within 0.5%. That sort of made my name as a current affairs and sports commentator as well, with a certain amount of knowledge, because the 10 o'clock closing came in, and for a 3-year parliament continued. How I knew they were going to win, that I'd actually, and that was the result, I'd arranged with Radio New Zealand to check out on the 2 main electorates in the country, in different electorates, which actually looked as if there was going to be a dramatic result one way. Both the results that came in, one was from Karori, which was rather a conservative National Party seat, and the other one was from Pororua, a very working class place. And both of their results were almost identical, a dramatic vote for 10 o'clock closing and a dramatic vote for a 3-year parliament. So that was how I was able to know about it. In fact, Jack Metcalf, I think it was, he came out after that again and said, "You couldn't say that." And I said, "Well, I've just said it. And I know that it'll be right. It'll be right within 0.5%, because I do know a bit about market research." And that's what happened. And again that night, we were able to forecast the result of the election, in this case, about an hour and a half ahead of Channel 1. We were very proud of that, because they had Avalon with all its bells and whistles. And again, I'd made a deal with Radio New Zealand to check the 6 electorates that were the most marginal in New Zealand, the previous electorate, and it'd be accurate exactly on the election result. And to select the polling booth that was also exactly on those electorates. And I got them to check those polling booths first, and when they rang through at about 7:05, I got the word through that the result was a swing to Muldoon and National dramatically, and it was exactly the same percentage swing on each of those marginal electorates. So again, with a bit of background knowledge on market research, I was able to come on the air and say, this is amazing. In the same way that Norm Kirk had an enormous swing 3 years ago, Rob Muldoon is about to sweep for power on the basis of the first 6 electorates, about to sweep to power with a swing of about 9%. And that's what happened exactly during the night. And an hour and a half later, we were so delighted to see that actually TV1 caught up with us with all its great electronics, and so the human factor was still a factor in broadcasting. My final question to him went something like this. I suggest to you, Dr. Brych, that had you been tried today before a public court, far from being found to be a medical specialist in cancer, you would have found to be a crook, a rogue, a thief, and a person who was in prison for attempted murder in Czechoslovakia. How do you answer that query, that challenge? And he said, looking at me straight in the eye, and then turned to camera and said, my patient's results, why don't you check them? Brilliant answer. So when we got that program on video, or actually on film, when we got that program completed and edited with back cuts and repeating it, it was pretty devastating, and we got it onto a plane to go back that night. But I persuaded our producer and director, who was George Andrews, a very competent television director and producer. I said, we cannot let that challenge go unanswered. Why don't we stay here and do it? Because we had already interviewed people whose kids were, they said, had been cured of cancer. So we stayed behind and did a separate program, which was run 2 weeks later. The opposite, saying, and it started off with a young kid who'd come to Cook Islands and she'd had cancer and was dying of it, and here she was running around the beaches and swimming with kids, etc. that day. And we did that program as a separate program. So the first one, I was the hero of the medical fraternity in New Zealand, and then 2 weeks later I was the hero of everyone who was a fan of Dr. Brych, because we showed those two programs. And that also, again, showed the benefit of having competing television networks, because we had a different approach to current affairs and news. The person we had who turned out to be the star of the show was Precious McKenzie, the South African so-called coloured weightlifter, junior weightlifter, who couldn't get a job, couldn't get a place in the South African Olympic team because of his colour. But he represented Britain and won the gold medal there. Well, we managed to persuade him to come on to the program, and I didn't ask him what his views were, but he came on about halfway through, and I get a little sign held up in front of me to say, Precious McKenzie has arrived and is in the back row. So I introduced him and asked him, you know, you're the man, one of two people who couldn't represent South Africa on international sports because of his colour. He's now in New Zealand and teaching people to do weightlifting in New Zealand. And what is your opinion on this issue? And he was absolutely brilliant. And he said, you do not want to go. I cannot speak for anyone else except myself, because I was one of the only two South Africans who could not represent their sport because of our colour. And you should not send the New Zealand team to South Africa for these reasons, bang, bang, bang. And it was wonderful. And from there on in, I was able to ask the audience, I want someone to tell Precious McKenzie that he's wrong, and our government, our new government is right, you know. That really made a quite hit, and we were able to continue the program on for the other half hour, so it made a very big hit. And that came out around about the same time as Ian Johnson, as the compere was an anchorman for the TV1's program done and videotaped in South Africa. So again, that shows the benefit of what we had, two different television channels and two different approaches to current affairs. I've been involved with the Learning Web, developing my own books sold from New Zealand, and now being much more involved in the whole future of touchscreen video books, because I believe that is the future of education, and more importantly, it is the future of publishing. And so far, unfortunately, in a country like New Zealand, where we have brilliant sporting, very brilliant sporting books, not one has yet been produced. Amazingly, even with Richie McCaw and Dan Carter's books, they're top-selling books, They should not be. They should be video books, so you can not only see what McCaw has done, not only see how his coach has coached the team. We have these models that can best be shown by video, showing exactly video in action. And that, to me, is the future. The only person doing that and showing that road for New Zealand so far, at the moment, is Annabelle Langbein. She produces her brilliant television programs, brilliantly how to cook, and she ties that in with the books going with those together. And the first person that does that with sport in New Zealand will lead the world in sporting publishing. The learning web in action.